The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old wood and floor polish, a smell that seemed to weigh on the shoulders of everyone who entered. It was a grand, imposing room with high ceilings and dark, heavy paneling that absorbed sound, making every shuffle of paper and cleared throats seem significant. At the front, elevated like a throne, sat Judge Miller, a man in his late 60s whose face was a roadmap of long, unamused lines. He had a reputation for being as sharp as a shard of glass and as patient as a starving cat. He peered down over his spectacles, his gaze sweeping over the occupants of his courtroom with a kind of weary disdain, as if he were already tired of whatever they were about to say. On the plaintiff's side, a man named Mr. Sterling sat with an air of easy ownership. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, the fabric shimmering slightly under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He had a slick, confident smile, and a lawyer who looked like he'd been carved from a single block of arrogance. The lawyer's name was Mr. Davies, and he moved with a fluid grace, arranging his papers and clicking his pen with a rhythmic, practiced motion that was clearly meant to intimidate. They were a team accustomed to winning, to having their way. They were here to crush a small, inconvenient obstacle, and on the other side, at the defendant's table, sat that obstacle. It was a young couple, Liam and Chloe. They looked as if they had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. Liam wore a simple button-up shirt and slacks that looked a little too big for him, as if he'd borrowed them for the occasion. Chloe was in a modest floral dress that she kept smoothing over her knees, a nervous habit. They were in their early 30s, with earnest faces and none of the hard-polished edges of the people they were up against. They had no lawyer. They were representing themselves, a fact that was noted in the court file with a kind of legal pity. They were completely alone. Judge Miller picked up the file, letting it drop with a thud that made Chloe flinch. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of profound boredom. "Property dispute," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He looked directly at Liam and Chloe, his eyes lingering on their empty table, save for a single, worn-looking legal pad. "Mr. and Mrs. Evans," he began, his voice dry and raspy, "while I must commend your spirit for taking on such a matter yourselves, I feel it is my duty to inform you that this is not a television drama. The law is a complex and unforgiving beast. Mr. Sterling's counsel has prepared a very thorough, very expensive case. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed without professional representation?" Liam stood up. He was a tall man, but he seemed to shrink under the judge's gaze. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "We are, Your Honor. We believe the facts of the matter are quite clear, and we are prepared to present them." Judge Miller raised a skeptical eyebrow. He exchanged a quick, almost invisible glance with Mr. Davies, a look that said, "Here we go." "Very well," the judge said, waving a dismissive hand. "But do not expect this court to slow down for you. We will proceed with the proper decorum and speed. Mr. Davies, you may begin." Mr. Davies rose from his seat, a predator who had just been given the signal to pounce. He smiled a thin, cruel curve of his lips and walked towards the center of the room. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned to face the couple, his eyes scanning them up and down, a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. "We are here today because of a simple, straightforward contract. A contract that my client, Mr. Sterling, entered into in good faith with the previous owner of the property in question. A contract that grants him the right to purchase a small but vital parcel of land adjacent to his development." He began to pace, his expensive shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. "A contract, Your Honor, is a promise. A promise that is legally binding. And yet, the defendants," he said, gesturing vaguely at Liam and Chloe, "have decided that a promise, a legally binding document, is merely a suggestion. They believe that their sentimental attachment to this piece of land somehow outweighs a century of property law." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the word sentimental hang in the air like a bad smell. Mr. Sterling smirked from his seat. Chloe's hand tightened on Liam's arm under the table. Her grandmother had left her that house, and the small patch of land behind it wasn't just land. It was where her grandmother had planted a garden every spring for 50 years. It was where Chloe had learned the names of birds and flowers. It was a living memory, and Mr. Sterling wanted to pave it over for a parking lot for his new luxury condos. Mr. Davies continued, his voice smooth and slick. We have presented the court with the original deed, the signed and notarized purchase option, and a survey from a licensed surveyor clearly marking the boundaries. We have also provided precedents from this very court, cases that have been decided time and time again in favor of the upholding of such contractual obligations. He picked up a thick stack of papers from his table. The law is not on the defendant's side. A motion is not a valid legal argument. Progress is not something that can be halted by nostalgia. Throughout his speech, Judge Miller nodded along, his expression one of complete agreement. He sustained every one of Davies's soft objections to the imagined arguments of the defense. When Davies paused, the judge would say things like, "Quite right. Counsel," or "an excellent point. It was less a trial and more a performance." With Liam and Chloe as the unwilling audience, Liam and Chloe just sat and listened. They didn't fidget or whisper. They didn't look scared or angry. They just watched and listened. Liam had his legal pad on the table, and he would occasionally jot something down with a cheap ballpoint pen. His handwriting was neat and precise. Chloe would lean over sometimes to look at what he was writing, and they would share a quiet, unreadable glance. To the judge and to Mr. Davies, their stillness looked like defeat. It looked like the calm resignation of people who knew they were completely out of their depth and were just waiting for the inevitable end. Mr. Sterling certainly thought so. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, looking like a man watching a foregone conclusion. He had already mentally spent the money he'd saved by not having to deal with a lengthy legal battle. He was picturing the wrecking ball, the fresh concrete, the gleaming new building with his name on it. Mr. Davies finished his opening statement with a flourish. "And so, Your Honor, we ask the court to do what is right, what is legal, and what is just. We ask that the court enforce this contract and order the defendants to vacate the premises of the disputed parcel, allowing my client to finally begin the work that will benefit this entire community." He sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Judge Miller took off his glasses and began polishing them with a cloth from his desk. He looked at Liam and Chloe, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "A very compelling argument," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now I suppose we must endure the counter-argument from the defense." He put his glasses back on and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any questions for counsel, or was that all a bit too much legal talk for you to follow?" The judge's sarcastic words hung in the air, a challenge meant to humiliate. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. Mr. Davies. The slick lawyer didn't even bother to hide his smirk, tapping his pen on his leather-bound portfolio as if counting the seconds until this farce was over. Mr. Sterling. The man who wanted to pave over Chloe's memories looked at his expensive watch, a clear signal that his time was being wasted. But Liam and Chloe didn't react the way they were supposed to. There was no flash of anger in Liam's eyes, no trembling lip on Chloe's face. Instead, Liam simply pushed his chair back and stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, devoid of any nervous energy. He smoothed down his slightly too large shirt and looked directly at the judge. "No, Your Honor," Liam said, his voice quiet but carrying an unexpected weight of calm. "I believe we followed it perfectly. The defense would like to cross-examine the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling." Judge Miller blinked, caught off guard by the lack of a flustered response. He had expected a stammer, a protest, maybe even a tearful outburst. He got none of it. "Very well," the judge grumbled, settling back into his high-backed chair. "Get on with it, then. But let's not make this a complete circus." Liam walked from the defendant's table towards the witness stand, where Mr. Sterling sat. With each step, his posture seemed to change. The slight stoop in his shoulders disappeared. His walk became more purposeful. He wasn't a nervous young man anymore. He was a man approaching a task. He stopped a few feet from the witness stand, holding his simple legal pad in one hand. "Mr. Sterling," Liam began, his tone neutral and conversational, Could you please state for the court the exact date you signed this purchase option? Mr. Sterling looked at his lawyer, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Sterling puffed out his chest. I did. It was signed on October 12th of last year. Liam made a small note on his pad. Thank you. And on that same day were you made aware of the restrictive covenant attached to the original property deed from 1952? The moment the words restrictive covenant left Liam's mouth, Mr. Davies was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor? He boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Relevance. This is an ancient document, a dusty relic from a bygone era. It has no bearing on the current legally binding contract. Before Liam could even open his mouth to argue, Judge Miller waved a dismissive hand. Sustained, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Mr. Evans, we are not here for a history lesson. I warned you about this. Stick to the contract at hand, the one you clearly don't understand. He shot a look at the court reporter, as if to say, Can you believe this guy? A quiet snicker rippled through the gallery. Liam didn't even flinch. He simply looked back down at his notepad, as if the judge's words were nothing more than a fly to be swatted away. He took a breath and continued, his tone unchanged. Mr. Sterling, he said, looking back at the wealthy man on the stand, your surveyor marked the boundary line here on this map. It's a very clear, straight line. Did you personally walk this line with him on the property? Sterling shifted in his seat. No, of course not. That's what I pay professionals for. I'm not a surveyor. I see, Liam said, making another note. So you've never actually set foot on the parcel of land you are trying to acquire? I don't need to, Sterling scoffed. I've seen the pictures. It's just weeds and old fencing. An eyesore. Judge Miller leaned forward, unable to resist. Let me guess, young man. You're about to tell us it's a magical forest full of fairies and talking animals. Let's move this along. The court's patience is wearing thin. The judge's attempt at a joke earned a few more chuckles, this time louder and more confident. The mockery was now out in the open. A shared joke between the powerful and their observers. Liam finally looked up from his pad, but not at the judge or the witness. He looked at Chloe. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he walked back to the defendant's table and sat down. He was done. For now, the judge looked surprised. That's it? You're finished. For now, Your Honor, Liam said simply. Chloe then stood up. Every eye in the room turned to her. If the judge had been dismissive of Liam, he was almost amused by her. He leaned an elbow on his bench, resting his chin in his hand. Oh, we have a second counselor, wonderful. Let's hear your thoughts, Mrs. Evans. Do you try to keep them simple? The sexism was subtle, but sharp. A clear message that she was even more out of her place than her husband was. Chloe ignored it completely. She walked to the same spot Liam had just vacated, her floral dress swishing softly around her knees. She held her own notepad. Mr. Sterling, she began, her voice clear and steady, a bell cutting through the noise. Your development projections, which you submitted to the city for approval, show a 15% increase in profitability if this parcel is acquired and used for a parking garage. Is that correct? Mr. Sterling was clearly taken aback by the question. It wasn't about sentiment or history. It was about his money. He glanced at his lawyer, who looked suddenly less certain. Well, yes. Those are the projections. It's standard business practice. Chloe nodded, as if this was exactly what she expected to hear. And does that 15% projection account for the potential environmental remediation costs for the soil on that land? The courtroom went silent. Mr. Davies shot up from his chair so fast he almost knocked it over. Objection, he yelled, his voice a little too loud. Speculation. There is no evidence of any environmental issue. This is nothing more than a scare tactic. This time, Judge Miller didn't just sustain the objection. He laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that was more insulting than any formal ruling. Mrs. Evans, he said, shaking his head. Are you a geologist now? Did you bring your little rock kit with you to court today? This is absurd. Sit down. You are wasting everyone's time. The gallery erupted in laughter. It was a full-throated, mocking sound. Mr. Sterling was grinning from ear to ear. his earlier unease completely gone. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying watching them be torn down. Chloe didn't react. She didn't blush or look embarrassed. She simply gave a small, polite nod to the judge, as if he had just made a routine procedural comment. She turned and walked back to her seat, her back perfectly straight. She didn't sit in defeat. She sat like a student who had just finished a difficult exam and was waiting for the results. As she sat, she and Liam exchanged a look. It wasn't a look of fear or shame. It was a look of shared, quiet understanding. It was a look of two people who had just gathered the last piece of a puzzle they were putting together. The laughter in the courtroom began to die down, replaced by a slightly awkward silence. The performance was over, but the main actors hadn't looked like they were part of it. They looked like they'd been in the audience, taking notes. Judge Miller, feeling the shift in the room's energy, wanted to regain control. He wanted to deliver the final blow, the one that would send these two naive dreamers packing for good. "Well," he said, his voice booming again, "this has been educational. I think we've all learned something today." He looked directly at Liam and Chloe. "Unless you have a magic trick up your sleeve, I'm ready to rule on this. I see no reason to waste any more of the court's time on this. Sentimental folly." Liam stood up again. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft squeak of his chair. His posture was different now. He wasn't the slightly rumpled young man who had walked in that morning. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his chin level. The simple legal pad was held firmly in his hand. "Just one more question for the witness, Your Honor," Liam said, his voice no longer quiet but clear and strong. "If you please." Judge Miller rolled his eyes, but a flicker of curiosity crossed his face. He decided to indulge him one last time. "Very well, Mr. Evans, make it quick. Your audience is waiting." Liam turned his gaze away from the judge and fixed it on Mr. Sterling. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He looked like a surgeon about to make the first incision. "Mr. Sterling," Liam said, his voice cutting through the tension, "you testified under oath that you personally reviewed the entire chain of title for this property before signing the contract, correct?" Sterling, seeing a chance to look competent and thorough, puffed out his chest again. "Absolutely. I leave no stone unturned when it comes to my business." Liam nodded slowly, a deliberate, almost pitying gesture. "Then you are personally familiar with the terms of the original land grant from 1898, which are, in fact, still legally binding." Mr. Davies's face went white. He was on his feet again, but this time his voice was strained. "Objection. Asked and answered. This is ridiculous. Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant." But Judge Miller was leaning forward now, his boredom replaced by a sudden, sharp interest. He had been a judge for a long time, and he knew a trap when he saw one being set. He just didn't know who the prey was. For the first time all day, he looked at Liam not as a nuisance, but as a potential threat. "Overruled," the judge said, his voice a low growl. He fixed his eyes on the now sweating Mr. Sterling. "Answer the question, Mr. Sterling." The wealthy developer looked from the judge to Liam, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was trapped. The entire courtroom was holding its breath. The mockery from moments before forgotten, replaced by a sudden electrifying suspense. The quiet couple at the defendant's table had just sprung their trap, and no one in the room had seen it coming. Asterisk, the silence that followed Liam's question was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, weighted thing, pressing down on every person in the room. It was the quiet that follows a sudden, sharp crack of thunder. A moment where everyone holds their breath, waiting for the storm to break. Mr. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of smug confidence just moments before, was now a pale, sweaty canvas of confusion. His eyes darted from Liam to his own lawyer, Mr. Davies, a silent plea for help. Mr. Davies, for his part, looked like a man who had just stepped onto what he thought was solid ground, only to find it was quicksand. He opened his mouth to object, but the words wouldn't come. What was the objection? He had no idea what an 1898 land grant was, let alone how it could possibly be relevant. He was a lawyer who operated on intimidation and expensive suits, not on dusty, century-old documents. He was completely out of his depth. Judge Miller was the first to move. He leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, his entire body language transformed. The bored, dismissive old man was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused jurist who sensed something significant was happening. The glint in his eye was no longer one of mockery, but of intense curiosity. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice low and firm, devoid of its earlier sarcasm, "you will answer the question. Are you or are you not familiar with the terms of the original land grant from 1898? Sterling swallowed hard, the sound audible in the dead quiet of the courtroom. I can't say that I am," he stammered. "My legal team handled the historical title search. They assured me everything was in order." He shot a venomous look at Mr. Davies, who suddenly seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. A small, almost pitying smile touched Liam's lips. It was a chilling expression, completely at odds with the humble demeanor he had displayed all morning. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Liam said, turning to face the judge, but gesturing towards the plaintiff. "Mr. Sterling's legal team seems to have missed something rather important, and they missed it because they weren't looking for it. They were looking for ways to win, not for the truth of the matter." He walked back to the defendant's table and picked up a folder, one that had been sitting unopened all morning. It wasn't a worn legal pad. It was a crisp, professional file. He pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, a photocopy of an ancient document.
Your Honor?
"This is a copy of the original land grant from 1898, deeding the property where the defendant's home now sits to the great-grandfather of Mrs. Evans." He paused, letting the information sink in. "It contains a rather unique clause, a reverter clause. It states that if the land is ever sold or developed for commercial purposes that are not directly related to the sustenance of the family living on the primary property, the ownership of the entire parcel, including the disputed land, automatically reverts to the nearest living blood relative of the original grantee." He let the words hang in the air. The gallery was completely still, the spectators leaning forward in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced by rapt attention. Mr. Davies finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. That kind of archaic clause would never hold up in a modern court. It's antique." Liam turned to him, and for the first time, there was a flash of steel in his eyes. "Is it counsel? Are you familiar with the state's Heritage Property Act of 1978? Davies just stared at him, his mouth agape. "I didn't think so," Liam continued calmly. "The act was specifically designed to protect properties with unique historical and familial significance. It contains a provision that strengthens and validates any pre-existing reverter clauses in land grants issued before 1920, provided the property has remained in continuous family ownership, which it has." Judge Miller held out a hand. "Let me see that," he demanded. Liam walked the document to the bench. The judge snatched it, his eyes scanning the old-fashioned cursive script with a practiced speed. His face was a study in concentration. He flipped through a few pages, then looked up at Liam, his expression one of dawning, almost horrified, realization. "Where did you learn to interpret 19th-century property deeds, son?" the judge asked, his voice barely a whisper. Liam looked him straight in the eye. "I spent the first 7 years of my career as a clerk for Judge Albright on the Court of Appeals. He specialized in historical land use disputes. I wrote the majority opinion on a case involving a similar reverter clause from a Spanish land grant. It was published in the State Bar Journal." The courtroom gasped. It was a collective, sharp intake of breath. The young man in the too-big shirt wasn't just a hobbyist. He was an expert, one of the best in the state. But Liam wasn't finished. He walked back to his table and sat down, the floor now belonging to his wife. Chloe stood up, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. She didn't have a folder. She didn't need one, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and resonant. "While my husband has addressed the validity of the original deed, I would like to address the foundation of the plaintiff's entire case." She turned her gaze to Mr. Davies, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Counsel for the plaintiff has repeatedly cited the state's commercial development statute, specifically Section 1 to B, As the legal basis for overriding local zoning restrictions in favor of his client's project, he has leaned on this statute heavily. She paused, letting the accusation settle. There's only one problem with that argument. She took a slow step forward. The statute he's quoting, Section 1 to B, was repealed by the legislature 5 years ago. It was replaced with a new statute, Section 1 to C, which contains significantly stricter environmental and community oversight requirements. In fact, I know this for a fact because I was a judicial clerk for the legislative committee that drafted the revision. I helped write the final wording of the new law. Another wave of shock washed over the room. It was almost too much to process. Not one, but two master attorneys hiding in plain sight. One an expert in historical property law, the other an expert in the very statute the opposition had built their case on. Mr. Davies's face was a ghostly white. He started frantically flipping through his own stack of papers, as if the law he had quoted for years might magically reappear. That's not possible, he sputtered. I have the latest version right here. Then you're in possession of a document that is 5 years out of date, counsel Chloe said, her voice devoid of triumph, stating it as a simple, tragic fact. A mistake that a first-year law student wouldn't make. I'd be happy to provide you with the updated code from the state's official website. If you'd like. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down, not in anger, but in a desperate attempt to regain control of a courtroom that had spun completely off its axis. Order. He boomed, but the word lacked its former authority. He looked at Chloe, then at Liam, a look of profound respect and fear in his eyes. He wasn't looking at defendants anymore. He was looking at two legal titans who had just woken up. He turned his gaze to Mr. Davies. Counsel, he said, his voice dangerously low. Is it true? Have you been basing your entire argument on a repealed statute? Davies couldn't speak. He could only nod, his head hanging in shame. The judge then looked at Mr. Sterling, the man who had wanted to pave over a garden. The developer wasn't smug anymore. He was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. His entire empire, his entire project, was built on a legal foundation of sand. And the tide had just come rushing in. Judge Miller took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He looked at Liam and Chloe, who were now standing side by side, a united, unstoppable force. He no longer saw a naive young couple. He saw two of the most formidable legal minds he had ever encountered, and he had mocked them. He had publicly humiliated them. A cold dread settled in his stomach. The court, he began, his voice now measured and formal, will take a 15-minute recess. He stood up abruptly and walked quickly into his chambers, without another glance at anyone. He needed a moment to process the fact that he had not just been presiding over a case, but had been a willing participant in a public humiliation of two master attorneys, who were now about to dismantle everything and everyone in that room. The storm had broken, and it was clear to everyone who was in control of it. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity. When the bailiff announced the court's return, the atmosphere in the room had undergone a seismic shift. The earlier air of casual mockery and bored superiority had vanished, replaced by a thick, electric tension. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. The judge returned to his bench, his face a mask of solemn professionalism, but his eyes held a new, wary respect. He didn't look at Liam and Chloe with pity or annoyance anymore. He looked at them as he would look at two unexploded bombs, carefully and with a healthy dose of fear. Mr. Sterling, the developer, looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his face was a sickly shade of gray. He kept dabbing at his forehead with a silk handkerchief, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, was in even worse shape. He sat slumped in his chair, staring at the tabletop, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The slick, confident predator from an hour ago had been skinned, leaving behind a trembling, pathetic creature. Liam and Chloe, in contrast, were the picture of calm. They had spent the recess not whispering frantically, but simply drinking water. They now sat side by side, their worn legal pads in front of them, looking like two experienced professionals ready to begin a routine day's work. They were the only ones in the room who seemed to be breathing normally. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the silence. The court will reconvene, he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier sarcasm. He looked at Liam. Counsel for the defense, he said. Using the formal title for the first time, you may proceed with your cross-examination of the witness. Liam stood up and walked toward the witness stand. He moved with an easy confidence that was completely at odds with the nervous young man who had entered the courtroom that morning. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the gallery. He fixed his gaze solely on Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling, Liam began, his voice calm and even, you testified that you personally reviewed the entire chain of title for this property. Yet you were unaware of the 1898 land grant and its legally binding reverter clause. Which part of your testimony was untrue? Sterling flinched as if he'd been slapped. I relied on my counsel, he stammered, his voice cracking. It's their job to handle the details. I see, Liam said, making a note on his pad. So you're saying you invested millions of dollars? Based on a contract for a piece of land, without personally verifying the foundational ownership of that land? You didn't think it was important to know if the land could actually be sold? The contract was clear. Sterling snapped, a flash of his old arrogance returning, only to crumble immediately under Liam's steady gaze. Was it? Liam asked softly. He held up the photocopy of the old document. This grant states quite clearly that the land cannot be developed for commercial purposes. Your plan is to build a parking garage. That's a commercial purpose. So, according to this legally binding document, which is supported by modern state law, the moment you break ground on that garage, the entire property, including your client's existing development, reverts to my client's ownership. Did you understand that particular detail? The color drained completely from Sterling's face. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled gasp came out. He looked at his lawyer, who was staring at his own hands, refusing to make eye contact. He was alone. Liam pressed on, his voice like a steady, relentless drumbeat. Let's talk about the financials, Mr. Sterling. Your entire business model for this project is based on acquiring this specific parcel of land for a parking structure, correct? Your projections, which you submitted to the court, show a profit margin of over 20%, contingent on this acquisition. Sterling just nodded, looking defeated. So now that you know you cannot acquire this land? What happens to those projections? Liam asked. What happens to the financing you've secured based on those projections? What happens to the contracts you've signed with construction firms? Are you aware that filing a lawsuit with such a blatant disregard for the established facts of ownership could be considered fraudulent by your investors and lenders? Each question was a hammer blow, and Sterling visibly shrank with every word. He was no longer a powerful developer. He was a man whose empire was built on a lie he hadn't even bothered to check. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, and his hands trembled in his lap. He had no answers. There were no answers. Liam looked down at his pad, then back up at the broken man. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor, he said, his voice devoid of any triumph. It was just a statement of fact. He walked back to his seat and sat down. The judge was silent, his pen frozen above his notepad. He seemed to be processing the sheer, brutal efficiency of what he had just witnessed. He then looked at Chloe, who was already standing up. Chloe walked toward the center of the room, her movements graceful and purposeful. She didn't look at Sterling. Her target was his lawyer. Mr. Davies, she began, her voice clear and cool. You have spent the entire morning citing commercial development statute, Section 1 to B, as the cornerstone of your legal argument. Is that correct? Davies looked up, his face a mask of despair. Why? Yes, he whispered. Chloe held up a thick, official-looking book. This is the current unabridged version of the state's commercial code, as published by the state legislature this year. She opened it to a marked page. Could you please turn to the section where you believe 12B is located? Davies just stared at her, his eyes wide with terror. I'll save you the trouble, Chloe said, her voice turning sharp as glass. It's not there. Because as I stated before the recess, it was repealed 5 years ago. It no longer exists. The law you built your entire case on is a ghost. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. I have a copy of the Repeal Act here, dated 5 years ago. I also have the new statute, Section 1 to C, which makes your client's project far more difficult, if not impossible. Under current environmental regulations, she took a step closer to the lawyer's table. My question is not about the law, Mr. Davies. My question is about you. How is it possible for a practicing attorney, an officer of the court, to be completely unaware of a fundamental change to the very statute he is presenting as his primary legal authority? Did you not perform even the most basic legal research? Did you simply pull up an old file and use it, hoping no one would notice? Or was this a deliberate, malicious act of incompetence? Davies couldn't speak. He looked at the judge, his eyes pleading for mercy, but there was none to be had. He had been exposed, not just as a bad lawyer, but as a fraud. His professional life was over, and he knew it. The silence in the room was absolute. The gallery spectators, who had been laughing at the couple just an hour ago, were now staring with their mouths open. Witnessing a public evisceration of a different kind, Chloe let him suffer for a moment longer before turning back to the judge. Her expression was no longer just confident. It was resolute. "Your Honor," she said, her voice formal and strong, "winning this case is no longer sufficient. The actions of the plaintiff and his counsel have gone beyond mere negligence. They have demonstrated a willful and bad faith attempt to misuse this court's time and resources to bully my clients and illegally seize their property. They have filed a lawsuit based on a fantasy, on laws that do not exist, and on facts they willfully ignored." She took a deep breath. "Therefore, in addition to seeking a summary dismissal with prejudice, the defense is formally requesting that this court consider imposing the harshest possible sanctions on both the plaintiff and his counsel for filing a frivolous and bad faith lawsuit. Furthermore, we respectfully request that the court refer this matter to the State Bar Association for a formal investigation into Mr. Davies's professional conduct." The judge leaned back in his chair, a look of sheer astonishment on his face. He had come into his courtroom expecting to scold a couple of naive kids. Instead, he was now being asked by those same kids to help them destroy their opponents. Not just legally, but professionally. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and utterly reallocated, and it was now sitting at the defendant's table. The silence in the courtroom was a living thing. It pressed down on Mr. Davies, the lawyer, making it hard for him to breathe. He could feel the sweat soaking through his shirt and his hands, which had been so steady and confident that morning, now trembled uncontrollably on the polished wood of his table. He was ruined. Not just the case, but his career, his reputation. Everything he had built was crumbling into dust around him. And the two people who had brought it all down were standing just a few feet away, looking as calm as if they had just finished a pleasant stroll in the park. The judge, a man who had walked into his own courtroom that morning as a king, now looked like a student who had been profoundly and publicly schooled. He stared at Liam and Chloe, his expression a complex mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning professional respect. He had spent decades on the bench, and he had never seen anything like it. He had mocked them, belittled them, and tried to run them out of his court. And they had responded not with anger, but with a surgical, devastating display of legal brilliance that had left him speechless. He took a deep, steady breath, the sound barely audible in the pin-drop quiet of the room. He had to regain control, not through arrogance, but through the sheer weight of the law. He looked down at his notes, then back at the defeated plaintiff and his counsel. "This court has heard the arguments presented," the judge began, his voice stripped of all its earlier sarcasm and impatience. It was now a formal, measured tone, the voice of a man who understood the gravity of the situation. "And it must be said that this has been one of the most illuminating proceedings I have ever presided over." Paused, his eyes fixing on Mr. Davies. "Counsel for the plaintiff has built his case on a foundation of legal fiction. He has cited statutes that no longer exist, and has demonstrated a willful ignorance of established property law that borders on professional malpractice. The behavior of the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling, has been no better. He has attempted to use this court as a weapon to bully these defendants, to seize property that he had no legal right to, all based on a flawed and fundamentally dishonest premise." He then turned his gaze to Liam and Chloe, and for the first time, there was a hint of apology in his eyes. The defense, while unorthodox in its presentation, has demonstrated a mastery of the law that is, frankly, humbling. They have exposed this case for what it is: a frivolous and bad faith lawsuit, abuse of the legal process, and a waste of this court's time and resources. He picked up his gavel, his hand steady. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Evans. The case is hereby dismissed with prejudice, meaning it can never be brought before this court again. The gavel came down with a sharp final crack. The sound echoed through the room, sealing the fate of everyone involved. But he wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing harder, this court grants the defense's request for sanctions. Mr. Sterling will be responsible for all legal fees and court costs incurred by the defendants. And as for you, Mr. Davies, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, your conduct today has been an embarrassment to this profession. I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar Association myself, recommending the harshest possible disciplinary action up to and including disbarment. You may consider your career in this state to be over. With that, the judge stood up abruptly and turned, disappearing into his chambers without a backward glance. He couldn't bear to be in the same room as the wreckage he had inadvertently helped create. The moment he was gone, the dam of silence broke. A collective gasp went through the gallery, followed by a wave of excited whispers. People were on their feet, craning their necks to get a better look at the couple who had just performed a legal miracle. Phones were out, cameras were flashing, and a reporter from the local paper was pushing his way towards the front, his face alight with the thrill of the story of a lifetime at the plaintiff's table. The scene was one of utter devastation. Mr. Davies just sat there, staring into space, a man broken. He slowly began to gather his papers, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped half of them on the floor. He didn't even bother to pick them up. What was the point? Mr. Sterling, the powerful developer, was a portrait of pure, unadulterated rage. His face was purple, and his eyes were bulging. He wasn't looking at Liam and Chloe. He was looking at his lawyer, his fists clenched at his sides. You, he snarled, his voice a low, venomous hiss. You incompetent fool. You've ruined me. Davies didn't even look up. He just stood up and walked out of the courtroom, a broken man leaving the scene of his own execution. Sterling followed a moment later, his face a thundercloud of fury and defeat. Shoving past the reporter without a word, through it all, Liam and Chloe remained a calm island in a sea of chaos. They didn't smile. They didn't celebrate. They simply began to pack their things. Liam put his worn legal pad into his simple briefcase. Chloe clicked her pen shut and placed it in her purse. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their actions completely at odds with the storm they had just unleashed. They shared a single, brief glance, a look of deep, shared weariness, but also of profound relief. It was over. As they stood up to leave, the reporter finally broke through the crowd and blocked their path. He was breathless, his notebook in hand. Wait, just a minute. Who are you two? I mean, really? You're not just some couple. You have to be. I don't know, federal prosecutors or something. Liam looked at the young man, a gentle, almost tired smile on his face. We're just a couple who wanted to protect our home, he said, his voice simple and sincere. But the way you handled that in there, the land grant, the statute, that was incredible. Why hide it? Why let everyone treat you like you were nothing? Chloe answered this time, her voice soft but clear. Because when people think you're powerless, they get careless. They get arrogant. They stop looking for the truth and start looking for an easy win. Mr. Davies and Mr. Sterling were so busy laughing at us, they never thought to actually check their facts. They did most of the work for us. The reporter stared at them, his mind clearly blown. So, what now? Are you going back to some big firm in the city? Liam shook his head as he gently took Chloe's hand. No, we're going home. I have a garden to weed, and my wife has a book she's been meaning to finish. He nodded politely to the reporter and guided Chloe through the throng of people. The crowd parted for them, a silent, reverent path. They walked out of the courtroom and down the grand marble steps of the courthouse. leaving behind the stunned whispers and the flashing cameras. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the cold, artificial light of the courtroom. They didn't speak for a long time. They just walked hand in hand, their shoulders touching. They walked past the expensive cars in the busy city street, heading towards the older, quieter part of town where they lived. They were no longer the master attorneys who had dismantled a powerful man in a courtroom. They were just Liam and Chloe again, a young couple in love, walking home. And as they turned the corner onto their tree-lined street, with the historic house that held all their memories waiting for them at the end, Chloe finally broke the silence. She said, leaning her head on his shoulder. For a minute there, I thought you were going to object to his use of the word folly. Liam chuckled. A deep, warm sound that seemed to chase away the last shadows of the day. Nah, he said, squeezing her hand. I figured I'd save it. It's always better to let them think they've won. Right before you take everything from them. They walked the rest of the way in a comfortable silence. Their quiet victory a secret they would share only with each other, in the home they had fought so brilliantly and so humbly to protect.